So I would like to introduce our next panel. And the question we wanted to ask, and we have great speakers for this, is the startup support ecosystem in Europe fit to support sufficient European sovereignty? So we talked a lot about sovereignty already this morning, and I'm sure also during the panels in the different tracks. So do startups really get what they need? So what is the status quo? What do they need? What do they get? And what do we have to work on? I'm really happy to introduce Agata Hidalgo, who is from France Digital, who will be animating our panel. So she's...
Thank you very much for the intro, Andrea, and for having me today. For those who don't know France Digital yet, as Andrea said, we are a startup and investor association. That's quite unique in Europe. There are not many such associations. We've been existing for the past 10 years, and we're very active both at national and European level. We're often in Brussels, and we have a person there, sitting over there. Hi, Antoine. So please join me in welcoming our great speakers for today. We have Gilles Babinet. Hi. The list of positions that you hold, it's very long. Maybe I should say you're attached to the Conseil National du Numérique, and that's just one of the many activities that you have. You're also an entrepreneur. I am sure many of you know you already. Then we have Arnaud Castagnet, who's VP at Skeleton Technologies, a very interesting scale-up from Estonia. We have Mr. Philippe Huberdeau, who is Secretary General of Scale Up Europe Initiative. And last but not the least, Guillaume Morelli, who's leading for Euronext, the French, Spanish, and Portuguese markets. So welcome all. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So the topic of our discussion is sovereignty, and especially, do startups have all that they need to achieve sovereignty in Europe? I would like to start with you, Gilles, so that we can put this conversation in context first. So you all know it. We're in a very peculiar time. There's war in Ukraine. China has risen as a global superpower. The US almost started a subsidy race when they launched the Inflation Reduction Act. ChatGPT mainstreamed AI for everyone all of a sudden. Do we feel a need to defend Europe these days? And does it affect our interpretation of what sovereignty means for us?
Yes, thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for having me. I would say it's mostly a political question, because until recently there was a common understanding of Europe as like mostly a free marketplace, and it's been criticized a lot because a lot of people said, you know, we're open to everyone, but not everyone is open to us, and therefore it's not the way it should be. And since the war, the Ukrainian war began, we started to realize that we need to become probably more of a political system, and as well as a power force, which is quite different, because if you want to be a power, if you want to enforce this power, you need to have a way to express something politically speaking. I would say it's not that far from the topic we're trying to touch upon, which is technology and so on, because at the end of the day, you realize that you need to have a direction, you need to have a will, and whether it's regarding the way you weaponize your armies and so on, or whether you use the technology to do so, it's the same type of thing. And I've been working with the European institution for like almost 10 years now, and to me it was very complicated to see that every time I wanted to touch upon a topic which I felt was interesting, a lot of I was replied a lot of time, okay, but you know, your thing is a little bit too political for us. You know, so I think it's a very good start as a conversation.
But times do change, so we may see more political leadership now on this. Taking the conversation to a more practical level, from the political to the practical. I don't know, sorry, over to you. So you're working at Skeleton Technologies, and one of the most important aspects of your company is that it has a sovereign supply chain, that is a fully sovereign company. How do we achieve that?
Thank you very much for this question, and hello everyone. Indeed, Skeleton Technologies is the only European energy storage company that makes both the batteries and our own raw material, which we have patented. And basically, this is a synthesized version of a graphene, which we call curved graphene. And for us, that's been extremely important because the company started from fundamental research, started with developing this raw material, which then we decided to use in order to manufacture energy storage devices, supercapacitors, super battery, and we're also working on solid-state batteries, with the idea of providing all the kind of needs and solving all the needs in energy storage. So we have our raw material production in Germany. We have our manufacturing of our batteries in Germany as well, and our HQ and the C-level is still in Estonia because all of the founders are Estonian. So we are really deeply involved in all these topics related to energy, to European sovereignty, topics related to strategic autonomy, and for us it's extremely important, especially since we are in the sector batteries, which is extremely strategic nowadays. I mean, 70% of batteries used in Europe are right now produced in China. At the same time, European countries have the goal of producing 85% of batteries for European markets by 2035. So it means we need to build, we need to invest, and we need to scale up production of this kind of technologies.
Sounds like the right company at the right time. Philippe, you have been running the Scale Up Europe initiative, which consulted companies just like Skeleton Technologies in the past. Could you please update us on this initiative? What's the state of play? What was its ambition for those who don't know it yet?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this very interesting discussion about sovereignty. So, Scale Up Europe is about sovereignty, indeed, and it's about a strong belief that sovereignty, now technological sovereignty especially, can only be achieved at the European level. So obviously, yeah, there are very interesting and important efforts that have been made at the national level, but now when we think about technological sovereignty, of course, we think about the US, about China. It's obvious that we can only play our role at the European level, and that's why we launched this initiative. This initiative was launched by President Emmanuel Macron, and really also bearing in mind that to reconnect with what Gilles Balbin said, Europe was perhaps a bit naive about these things, and so to quote Emmanuel Macron, he said that, well, the US, they have the GAFA, China has the BATX, and in Europe we have GDPR. So perhaps there is some things there that we can do more to up our game and to get to that level. So what is this initiative about? It's first and foremost a network of 200 founders and investors from throughout Europe that are a force of proposition to make things change, and that lobby also the governments to get things done. And we grouped them and we worked along 4 lines of work on the financing issue, on all issues related to deep tech, which is of course strategic when we talk about sovereignty. Third one is about talents, also a strategic asset. And last but not least, the relationship between corporate and startup. And so with that, we came up with a set of recommendations that we started to implement, but perhaps I could give you more detail a bit later.
Absolutely. Speaking of financing, Guillaume, Euronext is the leading stock exchange in Europe. How do you interpret sovereignty in your actions in the group?
So first, sovereignty for us is how Europe can be the number 1 in the world, and this is mainly our objective. So it's a question about reaching a critical size, and I think it's very important to understand that Europe is the largest economy in the world, is among the largest saving system in the world. But what needs to be done to first to retain European money in Europe, and then be able to attract international money into Europe, and this is why Euronext is willing to become the main infrastructure in Europe. So basically, as of today, we, through a very aggressive external growth strategy, half of all the bonds issued in Europe are listed on Euronext, and a bit more than 25% of all equities traded in Europe are traded on Euronext. So, but this is new. And this is the first way to achieve the European sovereignty. Then there is a second step that is not easy to achieve, but this kind of events are great for that, is that we need to believe we are European. One of the difficulties that we still have today is how we can convince an Austrian company to list outside Austria, because they want to list in Europe, in the main European exchange, and not in their local ecosystem. So we still need to build the European ecosystem rather than an addition of local ecosystem.
And we'll get back on those points later, absolutely. Gilles, back to you. Philippe mentioned earlier the US has the GAFA, China has BATIX. What is Europe missing to be a technology leader?
That's a big question, actually. There is no one single answer to that, because obviously the financing is one key point, and when you check the numbers, you really realize very quickly that, for instance, the average American, he spends 5 times more money on the equity market, the traded equity market, than the European ones, and that might be most of the answer in itself, because when you don't find easily the money to finance whether you seed investment or your growth investment, it's a challenge, and it will probably remain so over the next couple of years, even though you're doing a great job. It's a matter of common understanding and of culture overall to convince the people to invest not only in the equity market, but also in more risk-taking initiatives in general. And this is why I'm very much inclined to believe that we need to create new narratives, and the politicians, the authors, the filmmakers, they have their say to that. Let me just make some advertising for my new book, which has been released today. But the title of the book in itself tells a lot. It's the title of the book. It's a French book. It's How the Hippies, God, and Science Fiction Created the Internet. And it tells a lot in the sense that I've been working on it for like 4 years to understand what was the narratives behind China, the US, and Europe. And you see how much it diverges from one place to another. So, and I believe that the common dreams of each continent is different. One is about, it's a very utopian dream, the US one, like saving the world, changing everything, and so on. And probably on the 2 other continents, it's a little bit different. So this is one thing. The other thing, which is probably key, is to have a good equilibrium in between large corporations, universities, startup and civil society, and regulators. So this is not the way it should be. It's getting better, but it's, I could spend hours talking about that, and I won't do that for the respect of this panel, but you got it.
We'll attend the presentation of your book maybe then.
Read my book, it's even better.
So in the US, we find political leadership, dreams, but also money. Speaking of money, Arnaud, let me ask a provocative question here. With the IRA, the US created a lot of financial incentives for companies like you to move there. Northvolt has already done so. Does Skeleton consider moving to the US?
It's not our preferred option, this for sure, and it's not in our short-term plans. However, it's true that the launch of the Inflation Reduction Act has been is in every discussion for the battery industry. And there was a very interesting report from an NGO called Transport and Environment, saying that 2/3 of European gigafactories projects are currently under threat of being either scaled down or postponed or even cancelled because of the competition from the IRA. Because it's a combination of protectionism, but at least protectionism is something that happens quite often. But indeed, there will be some discrimination regarding whether batteries would be manufactured in the US compared to Europe. There's a lot of simplicity. It's very easy to understand how much subsidies you'd be entitled to, or it's very easy to apply for tax incentives. I don't know if anyone has filled the application for IPCI or any other European project, and it's, I mean, simplicity is not how I would describe it. And also there are massive direct subsidies. You were mentioning Northvolt. Northvolt is right now hesitating between setting its next factory either in Germany, in addition to the ones they have in Sweden, or so either in Germany or in the US. The US is proposing 70% of the total investment for the factory as direct subsidies, which is something that no European country can match. I mean, this would even be against the European rules. And what we see is that actually in Europe, it's not that hard to get funding when you're early stage startup or when you want to build a prototype or even first industrialization. And IPCI framework was made for this. However, when you want to scale, when you want to really massively scale and produce and build more, then it becomes much more difficult, because the EU always love to finance R&D innovation, and we all want that, of course. It's very important to innovate. However, sometimes, and especially in industries such as batteries, you just need to scale up your production. You need to build more. And we're talking about massive investments, which for now there's no like enough public support at EU level. There was the announcement, I think, a few hours ago about a new gigafactory in France from a Taiwanese company, Prologium. It's a 5 billion euros investment. So this is really massive, but this is the kind of scale of investments that are needed if Europe really wants to become sovereign for all the kind of clean technologies. I'm talking about batteries, but it's the same with wind farms, with heat pumps, with all the kind of clean technologies needed to reach net zero, while at the same time being the own producers of technology.
So we need investment, massive investment, quick and easy to access. And there is some work being done in that space already. Philippe, there is an important financial part in the Scale Up Europe initiative, the European Champions Fund. Could you please tell us more about it and how you selected the VCs that will benefit from this program?
Thank you, yes. So, yes, one of the key achievements from the initiative yet is this fund of funds that has been created, which is now vested with almost 4 billion euros. And as the name says, it will invest in funds. So, and the idea is really what we tried to do, also discussing with the ecosystem, with the fund and so on, is really to try to plug a market failure, because there are already lots of public funding instruments existing throughout Europe to invest in tech companies. But the idea there was really to plug market failure in the late stage financing of startups and scale-ups. Because when you look at the unicorns that were created over the last 10 years throughout Europe, we have 30 in France, we have something like 300 throughout Europe. Well, actually, what happens is that they are very well funded with domestic funding in the earlier stages of the development. But when they become a unicorn and when they are reaching a new level, you see that actually the lead investor in the late stage rounds are no longer European. They are either US funds or Asian funds or sovereign wealth funds or whatever, what you have. And this, of course, is really troublesome, because it means that in the end, the values they create will go elsewhere than in Europe. And of course, it's also an issue in terms of sovereignty. So that's why the Fund of Fund is targeting late-stage VC funds that will have a minimum capacity of 1 billion euro, because this is the size that you need to be in a position then to invest large tickets like 50 million, 100 million euros in one company. And so that's one of our strategic goals with this instrument.
Guillaume, there is a lot of pressure for companies to go abroad, be it from investors, Philippe just said, from governments with subsidies, as Arnaud was telling us. So what would you tell a startup? Why should a startup list in Europe today, do an IPO in Europe today?
You're right, there is still a lot of European bashing, even in this kind of event, so it is always great to have the opportunity to defend Europe first. The main idea to understand is why we should list, and what is the listing. Actually, in becoming listing is bringing yourself available to money where it will. So, for example, being listed on Euronext is getting, in theory, access to something like 90% of the savings all around the world, because being listed on Euronext is a way to be connected to European investors, US investors, Asian investors, and Middle East investors that are growing quite significantly over the last few years. So this is the first thing to answer. Then being listed on Europe gives you access to the widest pool of investors available in the world. If you want to list abroad, let's imagine that, for example, if you want to list in North America, you will only be eligible to a US investor. And I think this is very important. So you should list where you have the deepest access to the liquidity pool, but you should list where you are the most important in terms of ecosystem. And as a European company, you are important for the European regulatory environment, for the European education environment, for the European, even to some extent, tax environment. And I think this is also something that entrepreneurs need to be proud of. To give back what you receive so far. And, well, it's not the main advantage to be listed in Europe, but I think it's very important and worth to be mentioned. Then the second thing that needs to be understood is that being listed is also a label of quality. And so being listed in Europe is a strong label of quality, of credibility, that is 100% bankable, even in Asia, even in the US, etc., because it's just a question of being listed, being transparent, and being honest in the business, which is not the case of not always the non-listed world, but it's coming. And at the end of the day, being listed, the main advantage, and especially when we talk about tech and deep tech and sovereignty, is that it gives you times. And this is the most important, because this is the only way to get financed without any horizon of time. So it really distinguishes the needs of the financial, from the investor that needs to get cash back and return, etc., and your ability to define a 10, 20, 30, 50-year strategy. And actually, this is the only way to do it. Otherwise, what will happen, as you mentioned, is that to some extent, there will be a bigger player than European one that will buy the company, and at the end, we will do everything. We will support the growth, we will support scale up, but then the main return will be taken from abroad. And I think this is something we need to defend. So you should list in Europe first, of course.
I'm convinced. I hope startups here are also convinced. Gilles, Guillaume made an important point about European bashing. You were talking about narratives before, so my question is, how do we change narratives and attitude in Europe towards innovation? Should this change come top-down from Europe? Should it be bottom-up from member states? Should we meet somewhere in the middle?
Well, that's a big question, and I've been looking at it for like years. I have to say that I believe that there were a few players in the US that were structural in the narrative change in the 60s, for instance. Science fiction, for instance, Star Wars had a very strong impact. There were a lot of people who wanted to do like some cyber stuff coming out of those Star Trek and Star Wars films. If you look Star Trek, for instance, it's interesting because you have plenty of aspects that relate to computers. They have computers failures, they have virus, they have a lot of stuff which happens, which are quite triggering in terms of what we should do to avoid this thing to happen or to develop new technologies in that sense. And I was interested because that's one thing. The other thing which I believe is interesting is actually it's not the nicest things, but it's war. When you need to go to war, when you do wars, and when you need to have a system of arms that is the most edging towards science fiction and so on, you're investing a lot in new things, and you are more inclined to go towards, I would say, disruptive innovation than incremental innovation. And that's probably the main difference in between like traditional corporation and a startup. And startup would probably more be able to bet everything on one thing. Instead of corporate players, will want to have a return at any cost. And that's the thing we are probably the most at odds with in Europe. So it's also a lot about the demography. If you have youngster people, it's probably easier than if you have old people because they don't want to take risks. Same thing, you know. So you need to tweak different parameters at different places. I'm sorry not to have a simple answer, but you know, before I used to have a simple answer. Let's pour more money into the field, and we'll get everything done good. You know, it's not the way it works because you put more money and you create a bubble because you don't have the feed of startups good enough to swallow the money and transform it into developing startups and so on. So you really need to create an ecosystem, which we have started to do with actually BPI, with a few players around the table. But it's still in making. And the one thing we need to realize that it took 60 years for the US to get to where they are. You know, we just got started like in 2000, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15. You know, it's recent. And we can't complain and say why we are not comparable to the US. We didn't pay a shit, you know, attention to these people, to these startup people, among which I was. You know, I was struggling to get the funding, to find the people, to get the regulation right, and so on.
You highlighted several times the importance of having an ecosystem, and the EU strives a lot to create that. I don't know, Skeleton is part of the Battery Alliance at European level. So my question is, do this kind of initiative work? Are they useful to companies like Skeleton?
Absolutely, and I believe this is definitely the right approach. So, so basically, I mean, I'm not sure everyone is familiar with the European Battery Alliance, but basically this is an ecosystem that is managed by EIT InnoEnergy, which is the biggest investor in clean tech in Europe. It's one of the main investors at Skeleton, but they have also invested in Northvolt or Vercor in France. And they are organizing this ecosystem, gathering universities, research centers, companies, with the idea of working across the entire European value chain. So it's not only about companies that do cell manufacturing, but also companies doing materials development or recycling, for instance. And this is very important because it allows to really map all the potential partners you may have across the entire value chain in Europe. So you're building these partnerships, you are engaging directly with big industrial players. BMW is part of it and many other major businesses. And it's the right way for industrial scale-ups like Skeleton to directly build strong industrial partnerships. Because, I mean, we often tend to think about how to help startups, how to make them grow. But in industry, you need to build strong partnerships. You need to find companies that can help you build factories, invest in new and develop new innovation, help with investment. And these are the kind of ties that we need to be able to build across the entire EU, between all countries and between companies of different scale. And this is the kind of a forum that the European Battery Alliance is about. Are we going to be able to use the same framework for other sectors like semiconductors, hydrogen, etc.? I don't know, to be honest, but for battery, I would say that this is definitely the right approach.
About partnerships, people are key to this. So bringing together the right people, finding the right talent. Philippe, there is a part of the Scale Up Europe initiative that is about talents, it's the Tech Visa. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how, if in any way, interact with other initiatives like the European Blue Card?
Yes, so talents are really a key asset, obviously, and we already have lots of talents in Europe, but we need more to scale up, really, for our companies to scale up. And so the idea is to draw upon the positive experience from something like the French Tech Visa, for instance, which is working very well to attract talents to work with our startups or to found new startups in France. But again, if we want to have successful scale-ups that are everywhere in Europe that are global champions, they need to be able to attract talents in every European countries and to have these talents moving throughout Europe also between the different locations. So the idea is to bring together with the French Tech Visa the other national schemes that exist, because you have like 15 actually national schemes that are more like the French Tech Visa that exists in Europe. And to have all the information in one place, to have a one-stop shop for tech visas, for our scale-ups and for the talents that are interested to come to Europe. And then, in a second stage, to move towards a unified system, which could be the blue card. It doesn't have to, but the blue card could be actually a good framework to have this unified system, yes.
So we'll be following updates on this. I want to remain on the topic of people. It's very important to attract the right talent, but also to train the people that we already have here. Guillaume, at Euronext, you educate founders about how to do an IPO, and that's not an easy process. It may take years sometimes. What do you do to support entrepreneurs in this path?
Well, we propose through what we call pre-IPO program the ability for entrepreneurs to understand why they should do an IPO, how they should do an IPO, and also to ask all the questions you should get before launching an IPO process. And we do it all around Europe. Each year we train, we educate roughly 200 European startups, scale-up, and even sometimes unicorn about the rationale for them to consider a listing, and we position it way before an IPO process, basically 2, 3, even 4 years before a potential IPO process, because an IPO process doesn't take that much time. But the decision to take an IPO, the rationale to go public is much more important, and this is what we propose. And basically we bring the best expertise that are working in Europe, even sometimes from US players, for free. To entrepreneurs and to brainstorm about it and to share with listed companies and with also non-listed peers across Europe, also to build this kind of European tech culture. Because I strongly believe that there is a European way to grow that differs a lot, and there is a need to explain how we can keep this European culture going further. Otherwise, in most cases, we always want to copy what have been done a few years before in other continents, and I think it's a bad way to do.
Gilles, we've talked about many things. Money, talent, dreams, narratives. What else, in your opinion, do startups need to thrive in Europe?
Can I come back to talent?
You can, you may.
Okay, great. Because I believe, what's the country in Europe that has the most, the largest number of unicorns? UK, obviously. It's not even in Europe anymore. But still, there are 51 unicorns as far as I checked recently. And what do they have that is so special to make these unicorns? They have industrialized the making of talent by their top university system. It's also the second largest place in the world to come from abroad to do your education. And that relates very much to the fact that they're doing some very excellent startup. You just basically take some people from everywhere on Earth and you transform them into entrepreneurs. Like 1/3 of the unicorns from the UK are coming from Cambridge and Oxford alone. So that's just crazy. We didn't do that at all. You can check. As far as I could count, there are only 1 or 2 startups that have become unicorns that went through university incubators in Europe, in France. So it's definitely something that we could scale across Europe, taking the example of the UK to build it up on a larger scale. And also, there's a very good example is Switzerland, with EPFL and Zurich Polytechnic University. Same thing, they did like 2 universities did 4 or 5 unicorns. So I don't want to, dig in there, but obviously you got my point. So this is something we should do. The other thing which I believe that might be quite interesting, which is something that China did, is try to attract as many people, whatever the type of profile would they have, and get them into AI. You know, they did it. I can tell you a very funny story. I took a cab like just right before the COVID in Shanghai, and I started to talk with the guy. He spoke English, so it was easy. And he told me, you know, I can understand that you are into AI, but me too. You know, as a cabman in AI, because Xi Jinping once said, even my cabman must know AI. And they've wrote a book, AI for Cabman, which he read. Interesting, huh?
Is there an English translation of that one? So we can have a look. Thank you for that. These are macro trends that we are seeing all across Europe. I'd like to come to the micro company level, I don't know, and ask you, what are the biggest challenges that you face today in scaling across this continent?
For us, the key challenge right now is really scale up our production. So we have achieved a very decent commercial traction. We have signed more than 2 billion euros worth of contracts, commercial agreements, etc. So it's not our revenue for sure. However, it gets translated into revenue over the years. And in the meantime, you need to really scale up your production, meaning you have to deal with permitting processes. You need to identify the right industrial sites. You need to build the factory. You need to recruit the right people. And this is a really important challenge that we're facing. I mean, it's a nice problem to have. I mean, it means we have achieved a good commercial traction. However, we need to do it, and we need to do it fast, with also a lot of quality, of course. So we are currently building our second battery factory, but we already have to plan for the third and fourth one. Meaning that every time we have to think also about how to get the right profile, how to hire the right people, and this is something that we may underestimate, is that when we think about batteries, when we think about hydrogen fuel cells, when we think about heat pump, about small nuclear modular reactors, etc., the number of people that will need to be trained and that will need to have the right skills. We're not only talking about engineers or we're also talking about operators, about different kind of profiles. The needs for hiring and training and upscaling and reskilling is going to be massive, and I don't think any European country right now is fully prepared for it. So we need to think about how to adapt the education system to really serve the needs that we're going to have for the new industrial era that we're facing. Because when you look at what the US government is saying, it's going to be an era of investment, building, and back to manufacturing. Are we ready for this? Is the narrative about industry and about manufacturing in Europe, is it fully adapted to this? Do we make sure that enough young people and students want to pursue a career in manufacturing? Right now, it's not the case yet, but we need to really work on this, make people understand that this is about sovereignty, of course, but this is about innovation, this is about building a product, and this is what I believe is fascinating in manufacturing, is that it's one of the few places in the world right now where whether you're plant manager, CEO, operator, engineer, you're all working together in the same place for the same goal. And I think this is something that we, in some ways, we lost. We lost in the past. We built companies that didn't need factories, and we had divergent interests. But we need to find a narrative to make a lot of people want to participate in this new industrial era, because we won't have the choice. If I fully believe in European innovation. I mean, we had the example of COVID, where it's literally the first company that developed a vaccine was a European deep tech startup, BioNTech. So I really believe that Europe has everything to be able to innovate and take the lead in innovation. But right now we need to transcribe this into a collective task of rebuilding and scaling.
A lot of topics to be put on the political agenda, that's for sure. Philippe, what can Scale Up Europe do to support companies like Skeleton? Or the other way around, what can scale-ups do to further contribute to the initiative today?
Well, of course, Scale Up Europe can help with the financing. And what I didn't mention, I'm sure Skeleton is past that stage, but another important deliverable we have also is the new work program of the European Innovation Council, which is a very poorly chosen name, by the way, because it's not a council, it's an investment fund, actually. It's the investment fund for the European Commission investing in deep tech companies at an early stage. So they have a 15 million euros limit, but they invest equity in early stage in deep tech companies. So it's a very important component of the ecosystem for deep tech. Apart from that, the Scale Up Europe is also a network. So it's also about finding partners throughout Europe to grow, be it industrial partners, financial partners, partners to expand in another country or to find new markets. So we can also help in that way. And another important stream of work we have is about the interaction between corporates and startups, because I'm a strong believer that part of the problem and part of the solution lies also in the interaction between corporates and startups.
Speaking of the European level, Guillaume, you were talking before about the importance of achieving critical mass, and that's a big challenge. What kind of financial regulatory actions do you think Europe could take to create a real capital union in Europe? What can we do to create a bigger liquidity pool for startups today?
So how many hours do I have to answer to that? Okay, so maybe
2 minutes.
Maybe in a short way. So first, I think that we still need to invest into European standardization. So European is a unique market, even on capital market. But in fact, if you look into more details, we still have the involvement of politics that always want to put one specificity. And to give you a concrete example, if you're a tech company listed in Belgium and you want to raise capital also toward French retail investors, you can't. You can in theory, but in fact you can't. And so this is definitely something we need to change. So we need more standardization. And from that perspective, let's continue. We need to change about the way the European Commission is looking about trust issues. Because in fact our competition is global. When we talk about your competition, it's not it's global one. And from a European Commission perspective, if you want to build a European leader, there is a moment in time where they will block you, and they will prefer that your competitor will be sold to a Chinese company or to a US company. And I think this is something we definitely need to change, and especially looking at deep tech, because otherwise we will never reach the critical size. The second thing that we need to continue to change on it, there is innovation and new regulation coming, but I think that we need to be more also trying to implement the sovereignty in terms about the way our savings are spending. So actually, European money needs to be deployed in Europe first. And I think that it's progressing, but we are lacking of ambition. Let's give the example of Scale Up Europe. That is a great initiative. But when we decided to invest in tech, let's say at European level 10 years ago, we decided first to put money on early stage, then a few years later on late stage. But from an ecosystem perspective, we need more visibility. In fact, we need to get a plan that discuss early, late stage, and public equity. Otherwise, we will spend years to wait for the next step, and at the end, it becomes very difficult even for us to invest on tech. So we decided to do so, but it's a strong decision to invest on tech because we believe that Scale Up Europe will succeed, and in a few years it will bring us business. But we need clarity. We need to build an ecosystem from the beginning to the end, and not step by step, because otherwise it means that we are not ambitious.
I'm very glad you raised these points because it goes back to what we were saying in the beginning, the importance of ambition, will, leadership. I know we're running out of time, but I just want to open maybe the floor for 1 or 2 questions maximum, if any. Please.
Hello, thank you for this interesting panel. A short question: how to attract more women to SMEs and to deep tech? Besides having them on the floor as member of the panel also.
Should I take this one? Maybe you can start.
Getting back to the narratives, you know why there are no women in this field, because the whole narratives pushes women to believe that it's not the place overall. You know, it's even decreasing in the tech field. We have less women than we used to have like 20 years ago. And it's a mal attitude overall, which makes that, you know, no woman wants to go in this field. So I think it's interesting because it pushes back the idea that it's the market which drives the forces of things. It does, obviously, but not only. And the common belief are probably the strongest reason to do something. You know, so if we believe that there should be women in the field, and if we try to create the narratives to make them feel well in these places and to build it concretely, this will work, and this will work for everything. You know, I just wanted to end up maybe to push on your question. I think that we need to have common beliefs, and there are plenty of things that we could do. For instance, we could be at the merge of AI and environment and CO2, for instance. You know, we have excellent companies in the field, but we won't be able to achieve that if we don't first and foremost build the narratives.
If I may just jump in very quickly on this, I think there are 3 key points. One is role models, and I think we have more and more women in tech and science, and I hope this trend will continue so that more girls will be encouraged to take those paths, and entrepreneurship as well. The second is, of course, creating the right labor environment for women. So if you take maternity leave, you're not stopped in your career ascension. That would be great. And you have enough time to care and flexibility to care for your children if you have any, or if you have any other side projects. And maybe the third is more of a fact. There are many more women that study math, IT, engineering in Asia, and I'm not talking only about China, I'm talking about Iran, I'm talking about India, Southeast Asia. Maybe we should ask ourselves why. What kind of incentives work for them? Do they need any at all? So I think we should ask ourselves the right questions first. I don't know if any of you would like to add on this.
Just to say that there is an interesting example in Europe, which is Estonia, where actually I think that something like 20% of the founders are women. And it's interesting because it comes from the education precisely, and from the fact that during the Soviet time, women had a very large access to higher education, especially in STEM universities.
Yes, totally, and it's something that we can see also at Skeleton, given that we have sites in Estonia and in Germany. Indeed, I mean the access to talents, to women talents is much easier in Estonia because Estonia has invested massively to promote STEM education to women. I mean, if you go to a French engineering school, you're not going to see many women. So we need to. We definitely need to, it has to be a cause that everyone needs to put a lot of resource and effort in how to promote STEM education to women, how to also give and work on the soft skills to give the confidence also to choose entrepreneurship. And this is something that Estonia has been doing very well, supporting teamwork at school, at high school, etc., to make people start to be willing also to do more entrepreneurship, and especially women, and the sense of community. I mean, in Estonia, you can find a lot of fund built by women to support female businesses and to support other women in industry. So it has to be organized as lobby. Of course, it also, I mean, the other element is that we need, I mean, all men need working in industry need to have some self-reflection regarding the work environment, and if it's really inclusive enough to make a lot of, I mean, to make women thrive and find the best working conditions.
I think that's a very inspiring conclusion, Estonia being always a great role model. So I would like to thank all of our speakers. It's been very insightful. I really enjoyed this panel.